What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so going through the most recent episode of Legion, it seems to me the devil with the yellow eyes is the Shadow King. And I was kind of going through, because I was going through my knowledge about comics, and I was like, well, if the yellow-eyed devil is the Shadow King, then they've got to be drawing on something. What story are they drawing on where the Shadow King possesses Legion? And then it clicked. It's kind of like this origin of the Shadow King slash the Shadow King taking over Legion and then fighting all the X-Men. It was really kind of this cool little story for a little while, but it's called the Muir Island Saga. And what this was designed to do was sort of reset the X-Men back to the status quo. Because keep in mind, over the course of 17 years, Chris Claremont had made a lot of changes to the X-Men, done a lot of different things, so on and so forth. For example, with the start of his X-Men run, the original X-Men team, Cyclops, Beast, Jean Grey, Iceman, and Angel, had basically left. Now, they were brought back together by Louise Simonson and Walter Simonson as part of a group called X Factor, and we'll actually see them here in this particular story. But the fact remains that there eventually came a point where Claremont was effectively on his way out, where he was essentially leaving. And so Marvel's rule was, if Claremont's leaving, the X-Men have to be returned to the status quo. Charles Xavier, I believe, had regained his ability to walk, and I don't remember why. I don't remember why off the top of my head. If somebody down in the comments can tell me, that'd be awesome. I want to say it was during that whole instance where like Magneto took over the role of the X-Men when Charles Xavier almost died from a heart attack and took off to Shi'ar space, something along those lines. But the fact remains here that this story basically sees the return of Charles Xavier along with a handful of X-Men. And what I mean by that is, prior to this, in issues 273 to 277 of Uncanny X-Men, Claremont had written a story where a character named Lila Cheney had basically whisked the X-Men away to the other side of the universe, to Shi'ar space. And the reason why was because of the fact that the Skrulls were basically launching an attack against the Shi'ar. And the idea was for the X-Men to basically help the Shi'ar face off against the Skrulls. It was really kind of tying into like the Dark Phoenix saga with the relationship between the Shi'ar and the X-Men. It's not wildly important. It just kind of gives us a reason as to why the X-Men are coming back. But this really just kind of has Xavier seizing control of the Blackbird and masking the X-Men's presence from, a military base that's currently holding the Blackbird, and then just kind of racing off to figure out what happened with the X-Men. Now, what this also does is this coincides with a group called the Muir Island X-Men. The Muir Island X-Men were a wholly different group from Charles Xavier's X-Men, but they were called the Muir Island X-Men because they were, for all intents and purposes, mutants. And in fact, a lot of them would actually go on to be the second iteration of X Factor. Strong Guy, Polaris, Havoc, so on and so forth. They would be the second version of the X Factor team, the one that a lot of you guys probably think of when you think of X Factor. But the fact remains here, with Muir Island, this also has Rogue kind of coming back from the Savage Land. And that was a section of the X-Men comics when Claremont was focusing on her character specifically, where she was basically depowered. But it was also a point in her character's history where a lot of young guys were using the comic to help them get through puberty, if that makes any sense at all. It was written and drawn in a very specific way to appeal to young boys. But the fact remains here that it was really a lot of character development for her and how she sees herself and so on and so forth. But with Rogue's return to the rest of the world, to the, outside of the Savage Land, of course she seeks out Muir Island, just because of the fact that Muir Island is ran by Moira McTaggart, a mutant geneticist, a longtime friend of the X-Men, really one of the people that Xavier sort of defers to whenever it comes to figuring out what's going on with mutant powers when he can't really understand what's happening. But when Rogue gets to Muir Island, she ends up finding that it's basically been turned into a gladiatorial arena, that all these individuals are forced to fight one another. Now, where she's initially taken by surprise, she finds herself being caught up and getting immersed in the conflict. And what this is basically the Shadow King having taken over control of everybody on Muir Island. He seized control of everyone. Now, we'll get into like what his powers are here in a second, but that's what makes the Shadow King so dangerous. That's what makes the story so unique, is because this is basically going to be the X-Men versus the X-Men, and it's really kind of a cool story. But the idea here is that where Rogue is kind of considered the victor and where she's, taking a shower, so on and so forth, she's greeted directly by the Shadow King. And this is where the Shadow King kind of creeping into her mind turns into full-on possession. And what ends up happening is it basically feeds on her emotion, feeds on her regret, on her self-doubt, so on and so forth, and takes absolute total control. Now, what this also does is this allows us to transition to like Gambit, who's a newer member of the X-Men team. This is shortly after he was originally introduced into Marvel Comics. Jubilee, the same thing. She was recently introduced into Marvel Comics. Of course, she would go on to become a part of Generation X, but there's still relatively newer members here. Now, a little subplot that was going on during these stories was that you had Wolverine, who just didn't trust Gambit, and Gambit, who just didn't trust Wolverine. They actually end up fighting each other in the story, really because of the fact that that's what fans wanted to see. But with regards to everything that was taking place so far, with the X-Men trying to track down the Muir Island X-Men and to see what's going on. This basically leads, Banshee to more or less show up at Muir Island and discover that everybody's beginning to kind of go awry. And so what ends up happening here is Psylocke, of course, as one of the telepaths in the X-Men team, sort of goes out onto the island, does a little bit of reconnaissance work, but then she's immediately greeted by Legion. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is Legion is just possessed by the Shadow King. He's not really a host, and there's a distinct difference here. The Shadow King is a psychic entity, and we're going to go ahead and cross this barrier and have this bit of a discussion right now, but the Shadow King is a psychic entity that exists on the astral plane. Now, we'll find out how his character's evolved over the years, but he's a non-corporeal being. He's a spirit. He's an essence, and the idea is that he can seize control of physical beings and then use them as hosts. From there, he can spread his tendrils out throughout the world by feeding on self-doubt and the fear and rage and anger and hatred of all beings in existence, and basically use those to seize control of them and then empower himself. And that's really what's going on in this particular moment. Now, of course, Legion showing up is kind of a two-stage thing in the sense that with the character of David Haller, his telepathy is of such a scale that he's still able to keep some measure of himself. Not enough that he can control himself, but enough that he can kind of send out a message to Rogue saying, you have to help us. The Shadow King, or he is making us fight each other. Now, Rogue's not told who it is. All she's told is that someone seized control of the Muir Island X-Men. But almost immediately after this message is sent out, or is at least given to her by Banshee, the entire situation basically goes awry. And this is when all these different X-Men who are here are more or less taken over by the Shadow King. Wolverine is taken over by the Shadow King. Gambit's taken over by the Shadow King. The whole nine yards. All these individuals are basically attacked and possessed by the Shadow King himself. And what happens is the Shadow King basically appears to Xavier and says, we finally meet again, more or less. We're finally here at each other. And Charles Xavier absolutely panics. And the reason why is because he basically looks around him, to Psylocke, Rogue, Banshee, all these different guys, and basically sees that they've been defeated. The Muir Island X-Men have been taken over by the Shadow King, and Xavier really seems to be on his own. Not only that, Xavier is attacked by Colossus, who's possessed by the Shadow King himself. And that's what makes him so dangerous. That's what makes the Shadow King such a threat. So long as a person feels fear, so long as a person feels anger or wrath or something like that, then the Shadow King can seize control of them. And so because of this, Colossus just goes on a tear. I mean, Xavier's just kind of like fleeing for his life. That's really the best he could do, but at the same time, it's quick thinking, because Xavier's like, look, I know Colossus. I recruited him to the X-Men. I've helped him work through a lot of his past issues. I know him in some ways better than he knows himself. And so what ends up happening here is Xavier kind of has this little bit of a recollection, and even the Shadow King kind of talks with Xavier along the way. And of course, what this does is sort of hint back to the first time that the two of them had met. Now, when it came to the Shadow King and Charles Xavier, what had happened was the Shadow King had appeared in the form of a guy named basically Farouk. I want to say it was Amahl Farouk or Amahl Farouk, but basically he appears as a guy named Farouk. But Charles Xavier had been more or less duped into showing up inside of a little tavern in Cairo, Egypt. And where this guy was basically communicating with him telepathically, Farouk was speaking in a way where he seemed benign, where he seemed kindly. But Charles Xavier immediately began to pick up on the idea that Farouk had dark tendencies. And so the two of them began engaging in this psychic battle. Now, for the Shadow King, it was just a test, just to see what Xavier was about. So Shadow King wasn't fighting for keeps, but Xavier knew that if he was defeated in this psychic battle, that he would be left in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. And so he was ultimately able to defeat the Shadow King, and then Xavier went forward realizing how dangerous some mutants can be, and then used the motivation of this battle to form the X-Men. That's why he formed the X-Men in the first place. But the idea here is that he's able to more or less confront Colossus, and in doing so, basically feed on Colossus' fears, the fact that he has a better half, and kind of grab that better half, bring it forward, and then cast the Shadow King out, more or less making Colossus psychically face his own fears. And so what this does is this transitions to a guy by the name of Rice. Now, Rice is basically an FBI agent who's been working alongside the X-Men on and off for a short amount of time. I mean, he only really appears in about 8 issues or so, but he's joined with a woman by the name of Lin Shen, I think it is, or Lin Shen. Basically, this is a woman who we don't really know anything about, but this guy Rice is the human host for the Shadow King. And just to show you guys how powerful the Shadow King is, Rice was dead. The Shadow King resurrected his physical body and then took possession of it. He literally brought him back from the dead, or at least kind of took over his body. But the fact remains here that what Dr. Shen says is, look, you're in a body that's effectively dying. Your ability to function is confined to whatever this body can do. This body has no powers. You have to transition yourself to a body that has powers, find a new host, and then you can do whatever you want to with that host body. And that's really what this kind of transitions into, is this idea that the Shadow King is going to basically try to seek out the perfect host for his abilities. Now, what this also does is it tells us what the Shadow King did in his earliest days. All we really know, or at least all we're really told within within the contents of this story is that the Shadow King was just kind of born as, Farouk, and that as time progressed, he learned what it was that he was capable of doing. Eventually, the Shadow King spread beyond the normal powers of a telepath and began to realize he could seize control of other people. Now, later stories will actually come back and expand on this, and what they'll say is that the Shadow King is a multiversal entity. The Shadow King is like the Phoenix Force. In Marvel Comics, there's only one Phoenix Force across the multiverse, and it represents all life that has ever or will ever exist in the entirety of the multiverse. But there are different hosts for the Phoenix Force in each universe. In the main Marvel universe, it was Jean Grey. In another universe, it might be Cyclops. In a different universe, it might be Wolverine. With the Shadow King, it's the exact same way. The Shadow King exists as a singular entity, but the Shadow King can create hosts for itself in different universes. And so what happens is this guy, Rice, basically says, look, I need to find the perfect host. I need to move on to a person that can best suit my own individual needs. Now, back on Muir Island, of course, because of the fact that Forge is basically a mutant inventor, in a lot of ways, Forge is more or less just kind of ignored by the Shadow King. And the reason why is because of the fact that Forge is not really a notable mutant. I mean, Forge's power is to intrinsically know how objects work, to be able to look at technology and decipher it, but it's a mutant ability, meaning Forge is not like Tony Stark. Tony Stark can invent anything, or within reason, invent virtually anything. When it comes to Forge, if he were to lose his mutant power, he'd be no more capable of constructing a machine than you or I would, or at least assuming you're not some kind of electrical engineer or something like that. But because of that, Forge basically, constructs a device that allows him to basically fire this sort of neuro scrambler to a degree that sort of blocks out the influence of the Shadow King, and then turns around and will inject people with this serum that will basically block out the Shadow King for a extended amount of time. I mean, it's not really a permanent thing, but for an extended amount of time. It's really one of these sort of plot devices that will serve the purpose of allowing the story to see its fruition. But in the middle of all this, he's basically confronted with Rogue, and Rogue is the first person that he really chooses simply because of circumstance. But it actually proves to be one of the best choices because Rogue's one of the most powerful members of the X-Men. And so because of this, of course, he's able to subdue her and then more or less take her out. But from here, we switch back over to Charles Xavier, and this is when we learn the full effect of what the Shadow King's been doing. That with the Shadow King sort of expanding out and taking over the minds of people, it's not just isolated to the Muir Island X-Men, it's expanded to Muir Island itself, the local villages, and further out into the world, meaning that everybody's hatreds, everybody's prejudices, everybody's wraths have basically come to the surface. They've become the darker versions of themselves. And so what Xavier says is they need X Factor. They can't do this on their own. And so what this does is this transitions over to Xavier traveling to meet X Factor themselves. Now, this is where Jacob Rice comes into the equation, because remember, at this point in Marvel Comics, the original X-Men forming the X Factor group was a way for them to basically serve out the goals of Xavier, that is to say, to basically ensure the safety of mutants, but they did it masquerading as mutant hunters in the sense that they would travel around and they would say, we're here on behalf of the federal government to round up these dangerous mutants, and then they would take those mutants and smuggle them to Charles Xavier so that they could be taught to learn to use their abilities, and they would be out of the danger of humans that wanted to do them harm or governments that wanted to use them for their own ends. But X Factor had a lot of contacts, Henry Peter Gyrick, Jacob Rice, different things like that. But what this story is actually going to do is it's going to transition to the new generation of X Factor with the original X Factor team rejoining the X-Men. And so again, it's really kind of this transitionary story. But again, it's really Xavier saying, look, we need your help here. We have to defeat the Shadow King. And X Factor is immediately on board. And the reason why is because they realize how dangerous the Shadow King is. The Shadow King is this wildly powerful entity, and if left unchecked, he will lead the world into absolute chaos. That's really what makes the Shadow King so dangerous. I mean, think about it. A singular being that's able to bring out the hatred of all beings in existence and then just let that lead to its most logical conclusion of wiping out everything across the world. And so transitioning back to Forge, we really join him as he's continuing this quest to basically take out these various members of the X-Men who have been taken over by the Shadow King, Banshee and Wolverine and so on and so forth, and return them to a state of normalcy. What we also do is we have these small group of X-Men rejoining with regards to X Factor itself, Charles Xavier, who's sort of arrived here, but they're off the coast of Muir Island. The reason being because of the fact that the Shadow King doesn't know they're there at the moment. The reason why is because what Forge has done is constructed a series of these static zone pillars, so to speak. And what it's doing is effectively kind of weakening the influence of the Shadow King so that the Shadow King can't quite go in and shut everything down. It's really a way for the X-Men to sort of give themselves a brief reprieve for a short second. People are still possessed, but it means that the X-Men can move around to a degree without the Shadow King knowing everything everything that's going on. At the same time, the Shadow King's not aware of the fact that Jean Grey has basically regained all of her telepathic and telekinetic abilities. And so because of this, Xavier still has an ace in the hole to a degree. The problem is that Xavier doesn't know that the person that's standing alongside them throughout all this is Jacob Rice. Not only that, Jacob Rice is joined by Valerie Cooper. Now again, Valerie Cooper will serve as the governmental liaison to the second generation of X-Factor. But at the moment, Valerie Cooper is actually Mystique. And Mystique is a person that's basically been taken control by the Shadow King himself. And so because of this, the Shadow King's basically making all these different movements to essentially take out all the X-Men. Now, of course, with X-Factor showing up on the scene, this is really one of the first times, in fact, the only real first time that I can think of, where they're actually encountering the Muir Island X-Men for the very first time. And it's really kind of cool to see all this unfold. The problem is that try as they might to fend off and to take out and to basically save these different members of the Muir Island X-Men, in the end, it proves to be unsuccessful. And the reason why is because of the fact that Legion pops up. Now, of course, Legion showing up is being used by the Shadow King for the purpose of fighting off against all the X-Men. And Legion, of course, with his multiple personalities and his multiple powers, is able to hold his own. The problem is that Mystique proves herself to actually have been turned by Xavier. Xavier, somewhere along the line, had basically switched her back to being her normal self. Mystique takes out the physical body of the Shadow King, takes out Jacob Rice, and in doing so, frees the spiritual essence of the Shadow King, which in turn seizes control of Legion. Now, this is where things become incredibly dangerous. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that the Shadow King is basically going to take Legion's mind and restore it to normalcy. It's going to be very similar to what you guys saw in the Legion TV show, where the Shadow King's walking around and using all of Legion's powers. That's basically what's going to be happening here. Now, it's going to be short because Chris Claremont was never really one to have like these insane battles and these insane conflicts if they didn't really do anything to further the story. And so because of this, with Legion's powers more or less running awry to the point where it seems like he's out of control, and the Shadow King in the process of possessing him, the X-Men's attention is basically drawn to Polaris. Now, Lorna Dane is a character who had been part of Marvel Comics for quite some time, but she was basically somebody who had the powers of Magneto, but at this point in her character's publication history, she also had like super strength and different things like that. And so she was very similar to like Carol Danvers, plus the ability to control magnetism. And so because of that, she was wildly overpowered, but with Marvel telling Chris Claremont to set things back to a state of normalcy, this story is basically going to transition her character back to being simply someone who has the same powers as Magneto. But the idea here is that with Legion basically being taken over entirely by the Shadow King says everybody dies. And the Shadow King literally just more or less obliterates Muir Island in its entirety. Now, of course, not everyone dies here. In fact, really almost no one dies here. The only issue, or the only thing that really happens, is that, people are protected, by psionic energy and so on and so forth. Jean Grey and those different characters who are able to preserve their lives. But essentially what happens is Charles Xavier comes to the realization that the Shadow King in the body of Legion is just too powerful. And this comes to fruition when Legion starts fighting his father, when he starts fighting Xavier. Of course, a Shadow King possessed Legion is a force to be reckoned with. His telepathy, his telekinesis, his reality warping powers. Now keep in mind, at this point in Legion's publication history, his powers weren't on the same scale they are now. All you really had in terms of personalities was like Jack Wayne, Jamail Karami, and like Cindy, and maybe a couple other people here and there, but it was really isolated to like telepathy, telekinesis, fire manipulation, pyrokinetics, creating and manipulating fire, different things like that. But Legion is still insanely dangerous. Just his telepathy alone is well beyond that of Charles Xavier. And so because of this, it takes the combined efforts of all the X-Men and Xavier to take out Legion. And even then, it's only really done with a surprise attack by Storm from behind. And so what ends up happening is Xavier basically sits down and says, okay, look, we can't take out the Shadow King in the traditional sense. We can't fight Legion this normal way. Instead, what we have to do is fight the Shadow King on the psychic plane. And this is where the Shadow King is the most dangerous. What ends up happening is Xavier basically says, Jean Grey is going to be my anchor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use Jean Grey, or I'm going to basically jump into the psychic plane. And if things begin to go awry, then Jean Grey is going to pull me back. Now, to have this quick discussion for a second, because we've talked about the astral plane off and on, in Marvel Comics, the astral plane is kind of like this other dimensional realm that can only be accessed by people with like telepathy, people who have magic that allows them to do that. So like Doctor Strange, Wanda Maximoff, different things like that. But it's basically this realm that people with the ability to access it can travel into and read the thoughts of others, see the thoughts of others. The astral plane is a reason why Charles Xavier can read minds. The thoughts of all beings in existence radiate into the astral plane. And that is where the Shadow King's at his most powerful, because the idea here in terms of the origin of the Shadow King is that he came into existence when the first nightmare was ever experienced by the first being in existence. And so because of the fact that all people's thoughts and dreams and motivations and so on radiate out into the astral plane, the Shadow King began to grow in power by feeding off the nightmares of people as they slept. And so the result of this is that traveling into the astral plane, Xavier's basically met with the Shadow King at his most powerful form. And what this basically does, or at least what Chris Claremont does, is he sits down and he says, Xavier fighting against the Shadow King on his own is not enough. Xavier is not powerful enough to beat the Shadow King on his own home turf. And so what ends up happening here is the X-Men basically jump in. With the assistance of Jean Grey, the X-Men basically use her mind as a way to travel into the astral plane. And in doing so, it basically takes the entire roster of X-Men. And I mean to say, at this point in Marvel Comics, everyone who has ever been an X-Man is there fighting against the Shadow King. So, I mean, Colossus, Storm, Cyclops, Jean Grey, all these different members, those individuals who are not directly tied into what's going on, they all end up having to take on the Shadow King. And they are marginally successful, but they're only marginally successful in the sense that they keep the Shadow King distracted. The Shadow King's not actually defeated by the X-Men because they're just not powerful enough. Instead, what ends up happening is Psylocke leads the second group of people, which was the second half of the attack that Xavier was talking about. The physical conflict between the Shadow King and the X-Men comes in the form of Psylocke leading a team into Muir Island itself, into the actual building, and locating Polaris, and basically trying to find a way to sever the link between Polaris and the Shadow King. And that's when we learn that what had happened here is somewhere along the line when Lorna Dane's powers had expanded, when she had basically gained these abilities of super strength and so on and so forth, that she basically was targeted by the Shadow King. And the Shadow King used her powers to anchor himself to the physical reality and begin going through and influencing different people. That's how he got here in the first place. And so the only way to basically defeat him is to take out Lorna Dane, is to take out Polaris. Not necessarily kill her, but with basically Psylocke using her psychic knife, plunging it into the mind of Polaris and severing the psychic connection. And what this ends up doing is it basically ends up sending the Shadow King back into defeat in the astral plane, the X-Men essentially retreating, and then Legion, going back to his normal self, no longer being possessed by the Shadow King. But again, because of the fact that this story was designed for the purpose of setting things back to a state of familiarity, what ends up happening in the aftermath is Charles Xavier goes back to being paralyzed, simply because of the fact that his back was broken while he was in the astral plane. His body reflected his psychic destruction, and then it also ends up having the effect of the X-Men, or I guess X-Factor, rolling back over into the X-Men, and then the new generation of X-Factor going forward. But I thought it'd be kind of a fun story to go over here, simply because I wanted this to basically highlight the fact that this is how powerful the Shadow King is. The Shadow King is so wildly powerful that a full contingent of the X-Men and Charles Xavier could not defeat him. Like, they just don't stand a chance. And that's how it is when it comes to characters like that. They're wildly powerful in terms of their abilities because they're effectively immortal entities. Fighting the Shadow King is like fighting eternity, or it's like fighting the living tribunal, or maybe even the one above all, depending on, where you're fighting him at. On the astral plane, 100% full strength, the Shadow King is virtually indestructible. But again, it's really this crazy situation because there are these wildly powerful beings that exist like that. Now, outside of this story, if we were to say something like the Shadow King at full strength against Jean Grey with the Phoenix Force at full strength, there's no contest. Jean Grey wins. But Jean Grey, just by herself, just her telepathy at 100%, going against the Shadow King at 100%, not a chance. Franklin Richards, as an adult, possibly. I mean, that's the kind of power that we're talking about. Only beings of the highest order in the multiversal landscape of Marvel Comics can successfully take out the Shadow King. Now, how this will translate to the Legion show is a whole different kettle of beans. As we know, how things happen in film form on the silver screen and TV shows are usually completely different from what happens in the comic books, especially because of the fact that Legion's only 8 episodes. It really has to kind of start and end in the span of that time. And so I would say the Shadow King, if it is the Shadow King, wouldn't necessarily be killed so much as just kind of defeated. But the fact remains that if you guys enjoyed this video, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys dug this, make sure you drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about the Shadow King, because I love his character, but he's wildly powerful. And I will catch you guys later. Peace.